Hi everyone, welcome to DFTW, a channel to view the world from a unique perspective. Please subscribe to the DFTW channel and ring the notification bell to receive our daily uploads. Today we discuss the anti-China activists in the US and why they cannot overthrow the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China. In early January, in Los Angeles, a group of overseas Chinese activists held a formal meeting to announce the founding of something called the China Congress. This event was described as grand and serious, with many notable figures in the so-called overseas democracy movement in attendance, including Wang Dan, a well-known figure in the Tiananmen Square incident in June 1989. Wang Dan served as the chief convener. The organizers spent months preparing a constitution for this China Congress, and they presented it as a detailed blueprint for turning the idea of democracy in China from an abstract concept into a procedural and executable reality. At the January meeting, the organizers framed the China Congress not as a government in exile or a revolutionary leadership, but as an institution that could help advance Chinese democracy by creating a systematic, procedural model for how a democratic China could function. They have two key goals. First, build the structures and prepare for the Congress. Second, organize elections with voters selected from the overseas Chinese community. That sounds noble in principle, but a central and almost immediately obvious problem is, who are the voters? In this plan, the idea is that any overseas Chinese person could be a voter, but in practice, there is no meaningful way to verify genuine supporters versus people sent to sabotage the project. To address that, at the meeting, they agreed to a $100 participation fee per voter. The reasoning was that China's government would not want to pay thousands of dollars for fake accounts, making the system harder to infiltrate. Obviously, their poor situation in the US has made them believe the Chinese government, one of the world's wealthiest, if not the only one, cannot afford hundreds of dollars to undermine their cause. They also tried to learn from past mistakes of overseas groups. They promised, no personality cults are allowed, even though people respect figures like Wang Dan. They will not tolerate another Chairman Mao or President Xi Jinping in their organization. No lifetime leaders will be permitted, which is a direct criticism of Xi Jinping's consolidation of power back at home. No power grabs or defamation inside the group. No big national political manifestos, in contrast to earlier diaspora groups that issued broad declarations that made them look serious to outsiders but had little impact. To some observers, setting up such a group is an earnest attempt to build a legitimate institution with internal rules. They elected a secretary general and deputy secretaries, and they tried to prevent the factionalism that has historically plagued diaspora activism. But then something happened that dramatically changed how some people saw this movement. Just a few weeks later, on January 24, one of the China Congress's key members, Yuan, was arrested by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) when he went to check in as required under immigration rules. Another activist, Yi Rong, posted a video urgently calling on authorities to release him, even arguing that, as a member of the Chinese Congress, he should have diplomatic immunity. That claim earned ridicule online. People joked that the problem wasn't China shutting down democratic activists, but that American immigration authorities were the ones detaining them. Comrade Trump is helping President Xi Jinping again. To understand why the arrests mattered, we need to look at who these people are and how they entered the U.S. Yuan was 45 and previously a history teacher in China. He became disillusioned with the Communist Party because he asserted that topics like the 1989 Tiananmen protests and major disasters such as the Great Famine were routinely ignored or distorted in education. He later took part in Hong Kong's anti-extradition protests and the 2022 White Paper movements, exposing him to further confrontations with the Chinese authorities. Eventually, he left China via Ecuador and made his way to the United States without a valid visa, where he became active in diaspora political groups. He engaged in public protests outside the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles and helped organize gatherings to commemorate major protest anniversaries. He even created satirical, anti-communist cartoon, playing cards depicting Chinese leaders in a critical light. This trajectory, from domestic activist to diaspora political figure, reflects a broader pattern, Some Chinese nationals who illegally arrived in the U.S. seeking safety or asylum become deeply involved in political activism once they stealthily enter the United States. Other figures like Ling Huchongbing, Chen Weijie, and Yan Yoxin share a common story. They fled China through risky migration routes, often crossing multiple national borders, and entered the U.S. in the hope of safety, freedom, and eventual political organizing. Many joined various small parties or organizations that promised meaningful roles, such as party chair, vice chair, or department head, with responsibilities that mimic real political structures. But while these titles may sound impressive to insiders, they often belong to very small organizations with few members and limited public impact. Such groups tend to be fragmented and focus heavily on internal structure and symbolism, without effective strategy or mass support. A major issue overseas activists now face is not just internal disagreements but foreign immigration enforcement. After the U.S. presidential transition in 2025, there has been a notable shift in immigration policy and enforcement. ICE arrests of immigrants in the U.S. have significantly increased, including in major cities and outside immigration hearings. Numbers of detained migrants has surged compared with earlier years under previous administrations, with broad enforcement actions in communities and workplaces. In New York and surrounding areas, for instance, the number of Chinese migrants detained by ICE rose dramatically compared to previous years. Broad policy changes extended enforcement beyond individuals with criminal records to include those with only immigration violations. In this environment, activists who were already at risk because of their immigration status become vulnerable to routine enforcement. It means that Chinese nationals who entered the United States without a valid visa, even if they have political motivations and no criminal history, can be arrested and detained during routine check-ins with U.S. authorities. These enforcement trends amplify the risks for overseas activists. A routine immigration check-in can turn into detention. Advocacy groups now warn that participating in public activities without an immigration status exposes individuals to legal risks. Whether these detentions are politically targeted is debated, but the practical effect is that leaders of small overseas groups are being swept up in broader immigration enforcement. Even before the ICE issues, the overseas democratization movement has had persistent structural problems. Instead of uniting behind a single broad coalition with clear goals, the diaspora scene features numerous small parties and alliances, each claiming legitimacy through titles and constitutions, but with few real members. People often join because it gives them a title rather than because they're building a mass movement. In many cases, activists who became leaders only did so after leaving China and arriving in the U.S. For some, the motivation to be outspoken is tangled with the desire to secure immigration status. Activism and asylum strategies overlap. While someone is genuinely committed to the so-called democratic change in China, many are merely navigating immigration incentives. In a previous video, we talked about Luo Yufeng, who arrived in the U.S. legally around 2010. Shortly after arriving, she applied for political asylum. At that time, asylum applications from Chinese nationals were far more likely to be accepted than they are today, especially if applicants claimed political pressure, persecution, or credible fear of return. Today's overseas Chinese anti-communist activists are not as lucky as Lu Yufeng. Many of them have to enter the U.S. illegally. Also, many such activists lack the influence to attract more supporters. Their groups mainly operate outside of China. They have very limited influence on Chinese society at large. China's internet is an independent system that blocks external information, movement, and dissent within the country. Exiled groups can only shout slogans and organize symbolic protests abroad, but that doesn't translate into significant pressure inside China. One major reason the CPC is so hard to overthrow is its organizational depth. Over the past 100 years, the party has built a hierarchical, disciplined, and nationwide structure. It has also developed vast networks of control through local committees, law enforcement, propaganda systems, economic integration, and social services. The party also maintains internal discipline that suppresses widespread factioning. By contrast, diaspora groups remain loose coalitions built around personalities and small memberships, without comparable infrastructure. To understand why movements like the China Congress are unlikely to succeed in forcing systemic change in China, it helps to contrast them with the CPC's historical evolution. The CPC has spent decades institutionalizing its power. It controls the military and security forces, local and national government, economic levers in state-owned enterprises, media and education. It's not just about ideology, it's about integrated control of state mechanisms. Even when the party adapts to reality, for example, by allowing limited market reforms, it does so on its own terms. The party has shown an ability to adapt policy in response to domestic pressure while simultaneously cracking down on what it sees as threats. Protests can occur, such as the white paper protests or labor actions, but they rarely translate into systemic challenge or regime change. The CPC derives part of its legitimacy from national pride and economic progress. Many Chinese citizens, despite grievances, link stability and prosperity to party leadership. That psychological and societal anchor is an enormous buffer against foreign-based calls for color revolutions. At least in the foreseeable future, the idea that overseas activists, even with passionate ideals, detailed constitutions, and lofty goals, could topple the CPC is not supported by reality. Their efforts suffer from internal fragmentation and limited scale, as well as risky immigration status and exposure to enforcement actions such as those by ICE. Their own survival in the US is at risk. How can they bring about change in China thousands of miles away? Chinese people are mostly humble and modest. They will not stand up and fight with the ruling government if they can still survive. The deeply rooted institutional, social, and economic power of the CPC within Chinese society is the most important reason why it cannot be easily compromised. In other words, the CPC's resilience arises not only from repression but also from structural factors, national identity, and institutional depth. In contrast, diaspora movements are often symbolic, small, and vulnerable to external legal risks. Unless there is fundamental change inside China, driven by internal social unrest or turmoil, external groups alone are unlikely to force the CPC out of power.